So now let's talk a little bit about antihistamines and specifically focusing on H1 antihistamines because these are the most common ones that are going to be used over the counter or for the treatment of allergic diseases. So the general mechanism sort of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, the fact that these receptors are not activated only in the presence of a ligand, but are constitutively active. And they exist in a sort of equilibrium between this inactive and active state, as you can see here on the right. Now, what happens when histamine binds is that it simply favors the equilibrium of the active state. So we're going to have more receptors that are active, sending downstream signals, and simply antihistamines can be thought of as a inverse agonist. So they're just going to bind to a different area and cause the equilibrium to shift towards the inactive state so that they are less responsive to histamine molecules and sending less signals in general. So now let's talk a little bit about the difference between first and second generation H1 antagonists. So the first generation ones react with a tryptophan residue, tryptophan 428, which is a pretty conserved residue across many GPCRs. And what this means is that you end up getting a lot of binding to GPCRs that are off target, and especially off target in the central nervous system. So this is why, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, but this is why these old generation ones are really not favorable. They don't have a lot of specificity for the actual H1 receptor at all. Now compare this to the second generation ones. These ones are a lot more specific to H1 GPCRs because instead of reacting with the tryptophan residue, they're going to target lysine residues, specifically lysines 191 and 179. And this is going to give them way more specificity, allow them to cut down a lot of those side effects by not interacting with other GPCRs that they're not intended to. So just a quick overview of the structure. You can see here that they have a lot of aromatic rings, a lot of heterocyclic rings, and generally just it's a pretty lipophilic molecule, pretty low weight as well. But a lot of these antihistamines are mostly just derivatives of other antihistamines. So cetirizine and levocetirizine are obviously just enantiomers at that chiral center. Some of these are breakdown products of other ones. But they are quite distinct from the first generation ones functionally, even if they are quite similar in appearance. So now I have a couple of slides talking about the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of these H1 antihistamines. So the peak plasma concentration is going to occur around 0.7 hours up to 2.6 hours after you take them. So this is part of the reason why these are not the best treatment for anaphylaxis. These are more prophylactic measures. And the second generation ones are a little bit more studied because, 6-7 decades ago when these first generation medications came out, a lot of the regulatory agencies didn't have nearly as rigorous testing standards. So we don't have a lot of this data for things like Benadryl or hydroxyzine compared to things like fexofenadine or levocetirizine. Another thing that is sort of just interesting to think about is bioavailability. In the case of certain foods and liquids, they can really sort of mess with the availability of a drug. And in this case, something I thought was interesting is just the example of grapefruit juice. It inhibits OATP 1A2, which is a transport protein used to import fexofenadine. So that's one of the reasons why that you might actually have a sort of inhibitory effect if those are taken together. So I want to look at this graph here for a second. We can see that receptor occupancy is sort of displayed on the x-axis, and then flare suppression is on the y-axis. Flare suppression is one of the ways that, or I should say wheel and flare suppression is one of the ways that antihistamines are studied in vivo. So basically, what we see in this graph is that around 30 minutes in, you're going to reach upwards of 90% receptor saturation. Around half an hour, most of your antihistamine receptors are going to be blocked by the antihistamine. However, what's interesting is that at that high rate of suppression, you only get, or occupancy, you only get maybe 10-15% flare suppression, which is basically nothing. But if you just wait another 30 minutes, another hour, the receptor occupancy stays roughly the same, roughly around 90-95%, but we're skyrocketing to upwards of 80-90% flare suppression. So really the takeaway here is that these receptors are occupied quickly by these antihistamines, but you don't really see the full effects until at least a few hours. I mean, you can see by this plateau here on the top of the graph that even as the receptor occupancy drops, the saturation dropping, the flare suppression remains quite high, and that goes back to the idea of being constitutively activated. You don't always need the ligand there to have the downstream effects. This graph here is also pretty interesting. So it shows, roughly the same thing, but here we can also see that there's a slight discrepancy between wheel suppression and flare suppression. But the takeaway for this one is even as concentration in the blood drops of levocetirizine, you're still maintaining pretty high rates, if not maximal rates, of flare suppression and relatively strong rates of wheel suppression as well. So this is probably one of the most interesting slides here. So this is actually something that really surprised me when I was doing this research, but there are only 3 conditions for which H1 antihistamines are supported with strong evidence, and they might not be the ones that you think. So often we are encouraged to take H1 antihistamines for all sorts of food allergic reactions, but really those sort of fall into the closer to the weak evidence, or even potentially the no evidence base. So really what we want to use H1 antihistamines for is going to be allergic rhinitis, allergic conjunctivitis, and urticaria. So these are the ones in which H1 antihistamines are really strongly supported and are often like the first-line treatment. But all of these other things where you will actually see many providers still giving you antihistamines, this is much less supported by the current literature. So let's go through a few of these. Let's talk about allergic rhinitis. So there's basically 2 ways that it can work here. An H1 antihistamine could have a direct effect by basically just the exact mechanism we talked about, which is stabilizing the inactive state of the H1 receptor. But it can also have an indirect effect, and this goes back to the NF-κB transcription factor, and we are going to be decreasing inflammation through that pathway and through calcium ion dependent pathways as well. So this shows you that these antihistamines have more than one way that they can work. It's not always just by acting directly on the receptor, but sometimes there's a lot of downstream things that it can influence as well. For atopic dermatitis, this is an example of something that is less supported by evidence. So obviously histamine is a pyritogen that acts on H1, H4 receptors in the skin, but we often see that when you provide this to patients, the relief is going to be very incomplete. It's very rare that eczema is completely resolved by H1 antihistamine treatment. And the main reason you would give this in the clinic is a lot of providers want to avoid giving high concentrations of glucocorticoids. So this idea of glucocorticoid sparing effects. But in fact, there's actually quite little evidence to support that it has any bearing on the amount of glucocorticoids that are given. So again, that is another piece of complicating evidence. There's really no high-quality randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled trials that have confirmed that this medication is really efficacious in eczema at all. And the reason this is relevant is because there are certainly adverse effects that start to accumulate at high doses, and many providers reach these high doses because when the initial doses don't work, the loading doses don't work, they simply increase the dosage. Anaphylaxis, this one isn't really that surprising. So, big meta-analyses have been done looking at thousands of studies, and really they have found 0 that indicate any reason to give an antihistamine during an anaphylactic reaction. And again, this just goes back to the onset of action, which is just too slow, and that's not surprising to anyone. What is potentially surprising is that these could potentially have some sort of adverse effects as well, because the main thing that they're going to be relieving again is urticaria. Now, urticaria is one of the symptoms that antihistamines are indicated for, but in the case that urticaria is a symptom which precedes an anaphylactic reaction, it can actually be potentially dangerous to sort of obscure those early symptoms. So it's generally not recommended to take those if anaphylaxis is suspected. So let's talk a little bit about old generation H1 antagonists versus the second generation. So as we said, they have way less specificity. They bind to muscarinic cholinergic receptors, adrenergic receptors. They bind to serotonin receptors, so really just poor all around. And they have comparative sedative effects to things like ethanol. And that is relevant because they do they are indicated to treat things like insomnia, and they are one of the few options that remain to treat motion sickness. And they do that by blocking basically the histaminergic nervous system from communicating with the medulla's vomiting center. So it's one of the ways that they can treat motion sickness. So there are uses. You also see them used in nausea treatment for chemotherapy, nausea treatment for pregnancy, but really these sort of defining features that they're always going to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier quite liberally and cause these sedative effects in proportion to how many receptors they're occupying. So almost by definition here, the non-sedating antihistamines are going to be the second generation ones because they don't cross into they don't cross the blood-brain barrier. So adverse effects are much more common in the first generation compared to the second generation. And again, this is because they're able to act on the central nervous system much faster. We see in visual vigilance tests that poorer scores are found when you're under the influence of these drugs. You fall asleep much faster when you're under the influence of these drugs as well. And what's interesting is that a lot of this impairment is occurring before the drowsiness is actually physically perceived. So a lot of people think that sleepiness is sort of the main symptom, and that when you notice it, that's sort of it taking effect on you. But in fact, a lot of those impairments are sort of invisible. You don't notice them until it's too late. And these first generations are also a lot more prone to abuse as well. So because you can overdose on things like Benadryl, we see a lot of people, still calling poison centers for help, even decades after these drugs have been introduced, and a lot of campaigns have been run against them, even after we still have alternatives. And the reason for that is that you can very easily obtain these drugs over the counter without any prescription. They come in massive quantities, so they're very often implicated in suicide. And that's not really a problem that we see in second generation, where you could take, we've seen people take up to 30 times the sort of dose. And even at that level of overdose, toxic effects are quite rare. So I want to end on sort of a reflective note and just think about why doctors are still recommending Benadryl. Why is it that when a child is handed a food allergy action plan in an allergist clinic, more often than not, it's still going to be the drug that is listed, the name brand drug that's listed on those action plans? Well, the first one is actually quite practical, and is that there is some evidence that these act a little bit faster as compared to their second generation counterparts. So for something like anaphylaxis, even though antihistamines aren't really a desired treatment at all, there is still this idea that because they work faster, they might be the preferable alternative. The other thing is more just a social aspect, which is that these medications came out long before the second generation, and even though adverse effects were widely known upon their release, we didn't really have alternatives for a long time, and so they sort of became synonymous with food allergy treatment, and it's really hard to shake that from the social consciousness. And again, things like brand loyalty, recognition are all things that are going to be influencing this. But really, something that I want to argue with this presentation is that they should be generally avoided unless you're using them for one of the purposes that they are specifically preferable for, such as insomnia or motion sickness. But for things like allergic rhinitis or hives, really your second generations are going to be significantly more favorable.